Re-enable it. Okay, so this is going at regular speed. Now let's say that I wanted to stop this action here and freeze it for a few seconds. Now the way that you do it is just by using keyframes as you normally would. So I'll drop a keyframe here at this point. Now dropping the keyframe just records that frame at that position in time. Now let's say I want to freeze frame up until this point. Well then, if I want to have that same frame playing over that duration in terms of time, then I want to have the same information recorded in a keyframe here as I do here. The way to do that is just to copy that keyframe and paste it where the timeline or where the playhead currently is. So now what I've done is I've recorded a keyframe here and then pasted that information further down the timeline. So if it's going from a frame to the same frame over a few seconds, then it has effectively freeze framed. Okay, so that is freeze framing using keyframes, and you can stretch the amount of time that it freeze frames accordingly. Now, when it comes back out of that freeze frame, it's going to be faster. That's because what was previously taking this amount of time to get through the frames is now only taking this amount of time. Okay, so what you can do in that instance, if you want to keep the speed constant after the freeze framing, is to first of all copy your keyframe, then go to the point where you've copied the keyframe and go one frame down the timeline. So you can zoom in to do that. Paste the frame, zoom back out, and then multiple select the keyframe at the very end of the timeline and the keyframe that you've just pasted. Now if you look at the gap between these two keyframes, it stays constant. Okay, so the speed after that second keyframe is going to stay at a constant rate. The speed before the keyframe hasn't been affected, so I should get a natural speed. I should get it to stop, and then it should carry on at normal speed. Now, let's say that I want to do some speeding up and slowing down. So what I could do is I could again copy this keyframe here. So let's say that frame again, we have a freeze frame. Now we want to play it fast after that keyframe. Well, what I do down here is I place another keyframe, recording that position. Now think about it, there's a certain amount of frames in between these two keyframes, and there's a certain amount of time that it's taking to play those frames. So if I drag the keyframe off to the right, then it's taking longer to play those frames, and it'll play back slower. If I was to drag it to the left, it'll play faster. Then it'll play slower again because I've adjusted the amount of space between these two keyframes. This should seem similar to when you were first looking at keyframes and you were adjusting the speed of an animation by adjusting the relative position of the keyframes. Okay, so finally, if you want to play something backwards, then you just need to grab a frame prior to a keyframe. Here, for example, and you do that by keyframing it to record that frame, copying it, and then pasting it to a point after a keyframe. So now what you get is you're pulling frames out of their natural position and you're reordering them. So now it'll go forwards, backwards, and forwards again. So it's quite versatile, it's quite flexible. Now this is adjusting at a linear pace. Now if you pop this, you can do any of your easing functions on these, but if we pop this into our graphical view, now this is what we were looking at a moment ago. Now it should hopefully make a little bit more sense now. We've done some changes. We have it playing at normal speed. We have it stopping, flatlining essentially. Then we have it playing faster, backwards, and then back at, well, slightly faster than normal speed. Now you can see the changes in speed represented on the graph. Now the changes in speed will always be represented as the steeper the incline, the faster the action is happening. If it levels off, then it's stopping. If it goes back down, then it's playing backwards. And if it goes at a slight incline, then it's playing slowly. Now, when you're in graph view, then it becomes very easy to adjust the relative or the variable speed as you're moving through this graph. So we can see curves now, we can play around with those. So now what happens is it just stops dead. Let's say we wanted to slowly curve to a stop. Well, then I'll change the keyframe interpolation at that point. And there is no spatial because we're not dealing with space, we're only dealing with time. So I'll change that to Bezier. Click OK and adjust that curve. I can pull that down then to flatten it off again. And you'll see that it slows before it stops. So you can do that on your point here as well to slowly stop it before it goes into reverse. I'll zoom in. Now if you hold down Alt before you click and drag these, you can move them both as one. Okay, so I'll pull those out so there's a little bit more time between the reverse. Now it should work in a more even curve. Okay, so you can really play around with the action. You can make them dance by adjusting these curves as well. Now, when you go back into your keyframe view, you'll see that all of these have turned into eased keyframes. Okay, so what I would suggest is that the way that you should start it is with the keyframes. Okay, so try and get into the mindset where you're recording frames. So when you drop a keyframe here, you're not recording the position of an object in the composition window anymore. You're recording a frame. And then if you record another frame further down the timeline, by adjusting their relative position, you're speeding up and slowing down just as you were, but only in terms of the playback of the video. No objects move. Now I'll run through that again quickly. I'll disable time remapping. I'll re-enable it so I can start again. Now, take note, you have the first keyframe recorded, the last keyframe recorded. Now at any point here I can record a keyframe or record a frame in time by dropping a keyframe. I can go anywhere else, record another frame in time, and then I can reduce or increase the amount of time that it takes for those frames to be played and the intervening interval. Okay, so if I pull this to the right, I'm going to adjust the space here, I'm going to reduce the space here, and the time will be adjusted accordingly. So it'll slow down, and then when it gets to this side, it should speed up. If I want to play it backwards between here and here, I grab the point that I wanted to play back to, which could be here, for example. I copy that frame, so now this frame is going to be here, but it's also going to be here. So now it's going to go from this frame to this frame and then back to that frame. And finally I'm going to do a freeze frame. And a freeze frame is easy. All you do is you copy a pixel or copy a frame and then paste that further down the timeline. Now so long as you don't have any other frames in the middle there, then it'll just work as a freeze frame. Then what you can do is you can go into the graph mode, you can see the graph and you can adjust it this way if you want to. Now you can look at it in a visual sense, you can do it a little bit more intuitively maybe. If you want this to play fast and then reverse, you can just pull that up, it will play fast and then reverse. If you want this to freeze frame, then you get that value and then what you can do is you can paste that value in there. Okay, so there's lots of different ways that you can go about doing this. And finally, turn it from a linear speed change or linear speed into a Bezier and adjust the curves.